Hello there. Welcome back to another episode of our reading of Plato's Republic. We're now on Book 4. Do not worry, NZ Pieface. There wasn't much to miss in Book 3, in my opinion. They were merely describing how to educate the guardians of their city, the rulers and soldiers. And they said things like how they must not be exposed to anything that might lead them to vice. That was the general gist of the whole thing. They did also touch on the whole gold in your hearts thing. That is a big part of it. But not much to miss. Not sure what we're going to find out in Book 4, but hopefully we'll be able to make it through it. I had some trouble with the last reading, because I was doing them all. I'd done 2 more in days prior, so my throat was a bit sore and it was difficult to get through it. I've taken a day off this time, so hopefully we'll be able to get through it without any trouble. Let's get into it. Book 4. And Adamantis interrupted. Oh, one moment, I'll read the last paragraph from the previous book first, so that we remember where we are. Let's see. Hence, for them alone, among the city's population, speaking of the guardians and the auxiliaries, it is unlawful to touch or handle gold or silver. They mustn't be under the same roof as it, wear it as jewellery, or drink from gold or silver goblets. In this way they'd save both themselves and the city. But if they acquire private land, houses, and currency for themselves, there will be household managers and farmers instead of guardians. Hostile masters of the other citizens instead of their allies. They'll spend their whole lives hating and being hated, plotting and being plotted against. More afraid of an internal than of external enemies. And they'll hasten both themselves and the whole city to almost immediate ruin. For all these reasons, let's say that the guardians must be provided with housing, and the rest in this way, and establish this as a law. Or don't you agree? I certainly do, Glaucon said. And Adamantis interrupted. How would you defend yourself, Socrates? He said. If someone told you that you aren't making these men very happy, and that it's their own fault, the city really belongs to them, yet they derive no good from it. Others own land, build fine houses, acquire furnishing to go with them, and make their own private sacrifices to the gods, entertain guests, and also, of course, possess what you were talking about just now, gold and silver, and all the things that are thought to belong to people who are blessedly happy. But one might well say that your guardians are simply settled in the city, like mercenaries, and that all they do is watch over it. Yes, I said, and what's more, they work simply for their keep, and get no extra wages as the others do. Hence, if they want to take a private trip away from the city, they won't be able to. They'll have nothing to give to their mistresses, nothing to spend in whatever other ways they wish, as people do who are considered happy. You've omitted these, and a host of other similar facts, from your charge. Well, let them be added to the charge as well. Then, are you asking, how should we defend ourselves? Yes. I think we'll discover what to say if we follow the same path as before. We'll say that it wouldn't be surprising if these people were happiest just as they are, but that in establishing our city, we aren't aiming to make any one group outstandingly happy, but to make the whole city so, as far as possible. We thought that we'd find justice most easily in such a city, and injustice, by contrast, in the one that is governed worst, and that, by observing both cities, we'd be able to judge the question we've been inquiring into for so long. We take ourselves, then, to be fashioning that happy city, not picking out a few happy people and putting them in it, but making the whole city happy. We'll look at the opposite city soon, though that doesn't begin for another few books. Suppose, then, that someone came up to us while we were painting a statue, and objected that, because we had painted the eyes, which are the most beautiful part, black rather than purple, we had not supplied the most beautiful colours to the most beautiful parts of the statue. We'd think it reasonable to offer the following defence. You mustn't expect us to paint the eyes so beautifully that they no longer appear to be eyes at all, and the same with all the other parts. Rather, you must look to see whether by dealing with each part appropriately, we are making the whole statue beautiful. Similarly, you mustn't force us to give our guardians the kind of happiness that would make them something other than guardians. We know how to clothe the farmers in purple robes, festoon them with gold and jewellery, and tell them to work the land wherever they please and whenever they please. We know how to settle our potters on couches by the fire, feasting and passing the wine around, with their will beside them for whenever they want to make pots. And we can make all the others happy in the same way, so that the whole city is happy. Don't urge us to do this. However, for if we do, a farmer wouldn't be a farmer, nor a potter, and none of the others would keep to the patterns of work that give rise to a city. Now if cobblers became inferior and corrupt, and claim to be what they are not, that won't do much harm to the city. Hence, as far as they and the others like them are concerned, our argument carries less weight. But if the guardians of our laws and city are merely believed to be guardians, but are not, you'll surely see that they'll destroy the city utterly, just as they alone have the opportunity to govern it well and make it happy. If we are making true guardians, then, who are least likely to do evil to the city, and if the one who brought the charge is talking about farmers and banqueters who are happy as they would be at a festival rather than in a city, then he isn't talking about a city at all, but about something else. With this in mind, we should consider whether in setting up our guardians, we are aiming to give them the greatest happiness, or whether, since our aim is to see that the city as a whole has the greatest happiness, we must compel and persuade the auxiliaries and guardians to follow our other policy and be the best possible craftsmen at their work, and at the same time with all the others. In this way, with the whole city developing, being governed well, we must leave it to nature to provide each group with its share of happiness. I think you put that very well, he said. Will we also think that I'm putting things well when I make the next point, which is closely akin to this one? Which one exactly? Consider whether or not the following things corrupt the other workers, so that they become bad. What things? Wealth and poverty. How do they corrupt the other workers? Like this. Do you think that a potter who has become wealthy will still be willing to pay attention to his craft? Not at all. Won't he become more idle and careless than he was? Much more. Then won't he become a worse potter? Far worse. And surely if poverty prevents him from having tools or any of the other things he needs for his craft, he'll produce poorer work, and will teach his sons, and anyone else he teaches, to be worse craftsmen. Of course. So poverty and wealth make a craftsman and his product worse. Apparently. It seems, then, that we found other things that our guardians must guard against in every way, to prevent them from slipping into the city unnoticed. What are they? Both wealth and poverty. The former makes for luxury, idleness, and revolution. The latter for slavishness, bad work, and revolution as well. That's certainly true. But consider this, Socrates. If our city hasn't got any money, how will it be able to fight in a war? Especially if it has to fight against a great and wealthy city. Obviously, it will be harder to fight one such city, and easier to fight two. How do you mean? First of all, if our city has to fight a city of the sort you mention, won't it be the case of warrior athletes fighting against rich men? What's he on about? Yes, as far as that goes. Well then, Adamantus, don't you think that one boxer who has had the best possible training could easily fight two rich and fat non-boxers? Maybe not at the same time. Not even by escaping from them, and then turning and hitting the one who caught up with him first, and doing this repeatedly in stifling heat and sun. Wouldn't he, in his condition, be able to handle even more than such two people? That certainly wouldn't be surprising. And don't you think that the rich have more knowledge and experience of boxing than of how to fight a war? I do. Then in all likelihood, our athletes will easily be able to fight twice or 3 times their own number in a war. I agree, for what I think you say is right. Now hold on just a minute now, this is a very silly argument Plato is making. If they were to go against up in a war against a rich country, a rich city, why does he seem to think that the rich people will be the ones fighting, and not soldiers that they have paid for, with their money, with all their riches? Surely Socrates is not so stupid as to make such a poor argument. But I digress. What if they sent envoys to another city, and told them the following truth? We have no use for gold or silver, and it is unlawful for us to possess them, so join us in this war, and you can take the property of those who oppose us for yourselves. Do you think that anyone hearing that would choose to fight hard, lean dogs, rather than join them in fighting fat and tender sheep? No, I don't. But if the wealth of all the cities came to be gathered in a single one, watch out that it doesn't endanger your non-wealthy city. You're happily innocent if you think that anything other than the kind of city we are founding deserves to be called a city. Well, what do you mean? We'll have to find a greater title for the others, because each of them is a great many cities, not a city, as they say in the game. At any rate, each of them consists of 2 cities, at war with one another, that of the poor and that of the rich, and each of these contains a great many. If you approach them as one city, you'll be making a big mistake, but if you approach them as many, and offer to give to the one city the money, power, and indeed the very inhabitants of the other, you'll always find many allies and few enemies. And as long as your own city is moderately governed in that way that we've just arranged, it will, even if the city only has a few thousand men to fight for it, it will be the greatest. Not in reputation, I don't mean that, but the greatest in fact. Indeed, you won't find a city as great as this one among either Greeks or barbarians, although there are many that are many times in size, may seem to be as great. Do you disagree? No, I certainly don't. Then this would also be the best limit for our guardians, to put it on the size of the city, and they should mark off enough land for a city that size and let the rest go. What limit is that? I suppose the following one. As long as it is willing to remain one city, it may continue to grow, but it cannot grow beyond that point. That is a good limit. Then, we'll give our guardians this further order, namely, to guard in every way against the cities being either small or great in reputation, instead of being sufficient in size and one in number. At any rate, that order will be fairly easy for them to follow. And the one we mentioned earlier is even easier. When we said that if an offspring of the Guardians is inferior, he must be sent off to join the other citizens, and that if the others have an able offspring, he must join the Guardians. This was meant to make clear that each of the other citizens is to be directed to what he is naturally suited for, so that, doing the one work on his own, he will become not many, but one, and the whole city itself will be naturally one, and not many. That is easier than the other. These orders we give to them, Adamantus, are neither as numerous nor as important as one might think. Indeed, they are all insignificant, provided, as the saying goes, that they guard the one great thing, though I'd rather call it sufficient than great. What's that? Their education and upbringing. For if, by being well educated, they become reasonable men, they will easily see these things for themselves, as well as all the other things we are omitting. For example, that marriage, the having of wives, and the procreation of children must be governed as far as possible by the old proverb, "Friends possess everything in common." That would be best. And surely, once our city gets a good start, it will go on growing in a cycle. Good education and upbringing, when they are preserved, produce good natures and useful natures, who are, in turn, well educated, grow up even better than their predecessors, both in their offspring and in other respects, just like other animals. That's likely. To put it briefly, those in charge must cling to education and see that it isn't corrupted without their noticing it, guarding it against everything. Above all, they must guard as carefully as they can against any innovation in music and poetry, or in physical training, that is counter to the established order. And they should dread to hear anyone say, "People care most for the song that is newest from the singer's lips." Someone might praise such a saying, thinking that the poets meant not new songs, but new ways of singing. Such a thing shouldn't be praised, and a poet shouldn't be taken to have meant it, for the Guardians must be aware of changing to a new form of music, since it threatens the whole system. As Damon says, "I am convinced the musical modes are never changed without change in the most important of a city's law." "You can count me among the convinced as well," Adamantus said. I really wish this Adamantus man would challenge Socrates more, rather than just agreeing, but oh well. "Then it seems," I said, "that it is in music and poetry that our guardians must build their bulwark. At any rate, lawlessness easily creeps in there unnoticed." I'd say it goes even beyond elitism, NZ Pieface, and it is complete stagnation. They are building a city that is completely dead, that will have no change, because change could be bad. It's a very strange society. Yes, as if music and poetry were only play and did no harm at all. It is harmless, except, of course, that when lawlessness has established itself there, it flows over, little by little, into characters and ways of life. Then, greatly increased, it steps out into private contracts, and from private contracts, Socrates, it makes its insolent way into laws and government, until, in the end, it overthrows everything, public and private. Well, is that the way it goes? I think so. Then, as we said at first, our children's games must, from the very beginning, be more law-abiding, for if their games become lawless and the children follow suit, isn't it impossible for them to grow up into good and law-abiding men? It certainly is. But when children play the right games from the beginning and absorb lawfulness from music and poetry, it follows them in everything and fosters their growth, correcting anything in the city that may have gone wrong before. In other words, the very opposite of what happens where the games are lawless. That's true. These people will also discover the seemingly insignificant conventions their predecessors have destroyed. Which ones? Things like this. When it is proper for the young to be silent in front of their elders, when they should make way for them or stand up in their presence, the care of parents, hairstyles, the clothes and shoes to wear, deportments and everything else of this sort. Don't you agree? I do. I think it's foolish to legislate about such things. Verbal or written decrees will never make them come about or last. How could they? At any rate, Adamantus, it looks as though the start of someone's education determines what follows. Doesn't like always encourage like? It does. And the final outcome of education, I suppose we'd say, is a single, newly finished person, who is either good or the opposite. Of course. That's why I wouldn't go on to try to legislate about any such things. And with good reason. Then, by the gods, what about market business, such as the private contracts people make with one another in the marketplace, for example, or contracts with manual labourers, cases of insult or injury, the bringing of lawsuits, the establishing of juries, the payment and assessment of whatever dues are necessary in markets and harbours, the regulation of the market, city and harbour and the rest. Should we bring ourselves to legislate about any of these? Well, it isn't appropriate to dictate men who are fine and good. They'll easily find out for themselves whatever need to be legislated about such things. Yes, provided that a god grants that laws we have already described are preserved. If not, they'll spend their lives enacting a lot of other laws, and then amending them, believing that, in this way, they'll attain the best. You mean they'll live like those sick people who, through licentiousness, aren't willing to abandon their harmful way of life? That's right. And such people carry on in an altogether amusing fashion, don't they? Their medical treatment achieves nothing, except that their illness becomes worse and more complicated. And they're always hoping that someone will recommend some new medicine to cure them. That's exactly what happens to people like that. And isn't it also amusing that they consider their worst enemies to be the person who tells them the truth? Namely that until they give up drunkenness, overeating, lechery and idleness, no medicine, cautery or surgery, no charms, amulets or anything else of that kind will do any good. It isn't amusing at all, for it isn't amusing to treat someone harshly when he's telling the truth. You don't seem to approve of such men. I certainly don't, by God. Then you won't approve either if a whole city behaves in that way, as we said. Don't you think that cities are badly governed when... Don't you think that cities that are badly governed behave exactly like this when they warn their citizens not to disturb the city's whole political establishment on pain of death? The person who is honoured and considered clever and wise in important matters by such badly governed cities is the one who serves them most pleasantly, indulges them, flatters them, anticipates their wishes, and is clever at fulfilling them. Cities do seem to behave in that way, and I don't approve of it at all. What about those who are willing and eager to serve such cities? Don't you admire their courage and readiness? I do, except for those who are deceived by majority approval into believing that they are true statesmen. How do you mean? Have you no sympathy for such men? Or do you think it's possible for someone who is ignorant of measurements not to believe himself when many others who are similarly ignorant tell him that he is 6 feet tall? No, I don't think that at all. Then don't be too hard on them, for such people are surely the most amusing of all. They pass laws onto the subjects we've been just enumerating, and amend them, and they always think they'll find a way to put a stop to cheating on contracts and other things I mentioned, not realizing that they're really just cutting off a hydra's head. Yes, that's all they're doing. I'd have thought then that the true lawgiver ought not to bother with that form of law or constitution, either in a badly governed city or in a well-governed one. In the former, because it's useless and accomplishes nothing. In the latter, because anyone could discover some of these things, while the others follow automatically from the ways of life we've established. What is now left for us is to deal with under the heading of legislation. For us, nothing but the Delphic Apollo it remains to enact the greatest, finest, and first of laws. And what laws are those? Those having to do with the establishing of temples, sacrifices, and other forms of service to the gods, daemons, and heroes, the burial of the dead, and services that ensure their favour. We have no knowledge of these things, and in establishing our city, if we have any understanding, we won't be persuaded to trust them to anyone other than the ancestral guide. And this god, sitting upon the rock at the centre of the earth, speaking of Delphi, is, without a doubt, the ancestral guide on these matters as well, for all people. Nicely put, and that's what we must do. Well, son of Ariston, your city might now be said to be established. The next step is to get an adequate light somewhere and to call upon your brother, as well as Polemarchus, and the others, so as to look inside it and see where the justice and the injustice might be in it. What the difference between them is, and which of the two the person who is happy should possess, and whether its possession is unnoticed by all the gods and human beings or not. You're talking nonsense, Glaucon said. You promised to look for them yourself, because you said it was impious for you not to come to the rescue of justice in every way you could. That's true. I must do what I promised. But you'll have to help. You certainly will. I hope to find it in this way. I think that our city, if indeed it has been correctly founded, is completely good. Necessarily so. Clearly, then, it is wise and courageous, moderate and just. Clearly. Then, if we find any of these in it, what's left over will be the ones we haven't found. Of course. Therefore, as with any other four things, if we're looking for any one of them in something, and recognized it first, that would be enough for us. But we recognized the other three first. This itself would be sufficient for us to enable us to recognize what we are looking for. Clearly, it couldn't be anything other than what's left over. That's right. Oops, my chair's falling apart. Therefore, since there are four virtues, mustn't we look for them in the same way? Clearly. Now, the first thing I think I can see clearly in the city is wisdom, and there seems to be something odd about it. What's that? I think that the city we've described is really wise, and that's because it has good judgment, isn't it? Yes. Now, this very thing, good judgment, is clearly some kind of knowledge. For it's through knowledge, not ignorance, that people judge well. Clearly. But there are many kinds of knowledge in the city. Of course. Is it because of the knowledge possessed by its carpenters, then, that the city is to be called wise and sound in judgment? Not at all. That's called skilled in carpentry because of that. Then, it isn't to be called wise because of knowledge by which it arranges the best wooden instruments? No, indeed. What about the knowledge of bronze items, or the like? It isn't because knowledge of any of that sort. Nor because knowledge of how to raise a harvest from the earth. Well, that's called skilled in farming. Because of that. I think so. Then, is there some knowledge possessed by some of the citizens in the city we've just founded that doesn't judge about any particular matter but about the city as a whole and the maintenance of good relations, both internally and with other cities? There is indeed. What is this knowledge, and who has it? It is guardianship, and it is possessed by the rulers we have just now called complete guardians. Then, what does this knowledge entitle you to say about the city? That it has good judgment, and is really wise. What do you think that... who do you think that there will be more of in our city? Metal workers, or true guardians? Oh, there will be far more metal workers. Indeed, all of those who are called by a certain name, because they have some kind of knowledge, aren't the guardians the least numerous? By far. Then a whole city, established according to nature, would be wise because of the smallest class, and parts in it, namely the governing or ruling one. And to this class, which seems to be by nature the smallest, belongs a share of knowledge that, alone among all other kinds of knowledge, is to be called wisdom. That's completely true. Then we found one of the four virtues, as well as its place in the city, though I don't know how we found it. Our way of finding it seems to be good enough for me. And surely courage, and the part of the city it's in, the part on account of which the city is called courageous, also aren't difficult to see. How is that? Who, in calling the city cowardly or courageous, would look anywhere other than the part of it that fights and does battle on its behalf? No one would look anywhere else. At any rate, I don't think that courage or cowardice of its other citizens would cause the city itself to be either courageous or cowardly. No, it wouldn't. The city is courageous, then, because of a part of itself that has the power to preserve, through everything, its belief about what things are to be feared, namely that they are the things and kinds of things that the lawgiver declared to be such in the course of educating it. Or don't you call that courage? I don't completely understand what you mean. Please, say it again. I mean that courage is a kind of preservation. What sort of preservation? That preservation of the belief that has been inculcated by the law, through education about what things and what sort of things are to be feared. And by preserving this belief, through everything, I mean preserving it and not abandoning it, because of pains, pleasures, desires, or fears, if you like. I'll compare it to something I think it resembles. I'd like that. You know that dyers, who want to dye wool purple, first pick out from the many colours of wool the one that is naturally white. Then they carefully prepare this in various ways, so that it will absorb the colour as well as possible, and only at that point do they apply the purple dye. When something is dyed in this way, the colour is fast. No amount of washing, whether with soap or without it, can remove it. But you also know what happens to material if it isn't dyed in this way, but instead is dyed purple or some other colour without careful preparation. I know that it looks washed out and ridiculous. Then you should understand that, as far as we could, we were doing something similar when we selected our soldiers and educated them in music or physical training. What we were contriving was nothing other than this, that because they had the proper nature and upbringing, they would absorb the laws in the finest possible ways, just like a dye, so that their belief about what they should fear and all the rest would become so fast that even such extremely effective detergents as pleasure, pain, fear, and desire wouldn't wash it out. And pleasure is much more potent than any powder, washing soda, or soap. This power to preserve through anything the correct and law-inculcated belief about what is to be feared and what isn't is what I call courage, unless of course you say otherwise. I have nothing different to say, for I assume you don't consider the correct belief about these things which you find in animals and slaves, which is not the result of education, to be inculcated by law, and that you don't call it courage, but something else. That's absolutely true. Then I accept your account of courage. Accept it instead as my account of civic courage. Accept it instead as my account of civic courage. And you will be right, we'll discuss courage more fully some other time. If you like, at present, our inquiry concerns not it, but justice, and what we've said is sufficient for that purpose. You are quite right. There are now two things left for us to find in the city, namely moderation, using the word sophrosune, and the goal of our entire inquiry, justice. That's right. Is there a way we could find justice so as not to have to bother with moderation in any other sorry. I need to drink some water. Is there a way we could find justice so as to not have to bother with moderation any further? I don't know any, and I wouldn't want justice to appear first, if that means we won't investigate moderation. So if you want to please me, look for the latter first. I'm certainly willing. It would be wrong not to do so. Look then, we will, seen from here, it is more like a kind of consonance and harmony than the previous ones. In what way? Moderation is surely a kind of order, the mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires. People indicate as much when they use the phrase self-control, and other similar phrases. I don't know just what they mean by them, but they are, so to speak, like tracks or clues that moderation has left behind in language. Isn't that so? Absolutely. Yet, isn't the expression self-control ridiculous? The stronger self that does the controlling is the same as the weaker self that gets controlled. So that only one person is referred to in all such expressions. Of course. Nonetheless, the expression is apparently trying to indicate that in the soul of that very person there is a better part and a worse one, and that whenever the naturally better part is in control of the worse, this is expressed as saying that the person is self-controlled, or master of himself. At any rate, one praises someone by calling them self-controlled, but when, on the other hand, the smaller and better part is overpowered by the larger because of bad upbringing or bad company, this is being called self-defeated or licentious, and this is a reproach. Apparently so. Appropriately so, rather. Take a look at our new city, and you'll find one of these in it. You'll say that it is rightly called self-controlled, if indeed something in which the better rules the worse is properly called moderate and self-controlled. I am looking, what you say is true. Now, one finds all kinds of diverse desires, pleasures, and pains, mostly in children, women, household slaves, and in those of the inferior majority who are called free. That's right. But you meet with these desires that are simple, measured, and directed by calculation, in accordance with understanding and correct belief only in the few people who are born with the best natures and receive the best education. That's true. Then don't you see that in your city too, the desires of the inferior many, are controlled by the wisdom and the desires of the superior few? I do. Therefore, if any city is said to be in control of itself and of its pleasures and desires, it is this one. Absolutely. And isn't it therefore also moderate because of this? It is. And further, if indeed the ruler and the ruled in any city share the same belief about who should rule, it is this one. Or don't you agree? I agree entirely. And when the citizens agree in this way, in which of them do you say moderation is located? In the ruler or the ruled? I suppose in both. Then you see how right we were to divine that moderation resembles a kind of harmony. How so? Because unlike courage and wisdom, each of which resides in one part, making the city brave and wise respectively, moderation spreads throughout the whole city. It makes the weakest the strongest, and those in between, whether in regard to reason, physical strength, numbers, wealth, or anything else, all sing the same song together. And this unanimity, this agreement between the naturally worse and the naturally better, as to which of the two is to rule both in the city, and each one is rightly called moderation. I agree completely. Alright, we've now found, at least from the point of view of our present beliefs, 3 of the 4 virtues in our city. So what kind of virtue is left? And that makes the city share even further in virtue. Surely it's clear that it is justice. That is clear. Alright, I'm going to take a 5-minute break here, actually, because I want to make sure I don't hurt my voice by speaking longer. Last time I had trouble, so I'm gonna be reserved here and take a short break. Turn in 5 minutes. I'm back. We were just talking about the kind of virtues found in the city and where they can be found in it. And we have now arrived at the fourth virtue, that is justice. Let me find the line. Where is the line? Ah, there it is, right at the top of the page. Alright, we have now found, at least from the point of view of our present beliefs, 3 of the 4 virtues in our city. So, what kind of virtue is left, then, that makes the city share even further in virtue? Surely it's clear that it is justice. That is clear. Then, Glaucon, we must station ourselves, like hunters surrounding a wood, and focus our understanding, so that justice doesn't escape us and vanish into obscurity, for obviously it's around here somewhere. So look and try eagerly to catch sight of it, and if you happen to see it before I do, you can tell me about it. I wish I could, but you'll make better use of me if you take me to be a follower, who can see things when you point them out to him. Follow then, and join me in a prayer. I'll do that, just so long as you lead. I certainly will, though the place seems to be impenetrable, and full of shadows. It is certainly dark and hard to search through, but all the same we must go on. Indeed we must. And then, I caught sight of something. Aha, Glaucon, it looks as though there's a track here, so it seems that our quarry won't altogether escape us. That's good news. Either that, or we've just been stupid. In what way? Because we are looking for what seems to have been rolling around at our feet from the beginning, and we didn't see it, which was ridiculous of us, just as people sometimes search for the very thing they are holding in their hands. So we didn't look in the right direction, but gazed off into the distance, and that's probably why we didn't notice it. Side note, that's rather funny. Looking for things that you are holding in your hands. What a strikingly modern thing to do. It's amusing how the common things that we all do were still done thousands of years ago. Incredible. Indeed, some things never change. That's a long prelude for someone who wants to hear the answer. Then listen and see whether there's anything in what I say. Justice, I think, is exactly what we've said must be established throughout the city when we were founding it. Either that or some form of it. We stated, and often repeated, if you remember, that everyone must practice one of the occupations in the city for which he is namely suited best. Yes, we did keep saying that. Moreover, we heard many people say, and have often said ourselves, that justice is doing one's own work, and not meddling with what isn't one's own. Yes, we have. Then it turns out that doing one's own work, provided that it comes to be in a certain way, is justice. And do you know that and do you know what I take as evidence of this? No, tell me. I think that what was left over in the city, when moderation, courage, and wisdom have been found, it is the power that makes it possible for them to grow in the city, and that preserves them when they've grown for so long as it remains there itself. And of course we said that justice would be what was left over when we had found the other 3. Yes, that must be so. And surely if we had to decide which of the 4 will make the city good by its presence, it would be a hard decision. Is it the agreements that... Is it the agreements in belief between the rulers and the ruled, or the preservation among the soldiers, of the law-inspired belief about what is to be feared and what isn't? Or the wisdom and guardianship of the rulers? Or is it, above all, the fact that every child, woman, slave, freeman, craftsman, ruler, and ruled, each does his own work and doesn't meddle with what is other people's? How could this fail to be a hard decision? It seems, then, that the power that consists in everyone doing their own work rivals wisdom, moderation, and courage in its contribution to the virtue of the city. It certainly does. And wouldn't you call this rival to the others in its contribution to the city's virtue? Absolutely. Sorry, I missed a line there. And wouldn't you call this rival to the others in its contribution to the city's virtue justice? Absolutely. Look at it this way, if you want to be convinced. Wouldn't you order your rulers to act as judges in the city's courts? Of course. And won't their sole aim in delivering judgments be that no citizen should have what belongs to another, or be deprived of what is his own? They'll have no aim but that, because that is just. Yes. Therefore, from this point of view also, the having and doing of one's own would be accepted as justice. That's right. Consider then, and see whether you agree with me about this, if a carpenter attempts to do the work of a cobbler, or a cobbler that of a carpenter, or they exchange their tools or honours with one another, or if the same person tries to do both jobs, and all other such exchanges are made, do you think that does any great harm to the city? Not much. But I suppose that when someone who is by nature a craftsman or some other kind of money-maker is puffed up by wealth, or by having a majority of votes, or by his own strength, or by some other such thing, and attempts to enter the class of soldiers, or one of the unworthy soldiers tries to enter that of the judges and guardians, and these exchange their tools and honours, or when the same person tries to do all of these things at once, then I think you'll agree that these exchanges and this sort of meddling bring the city to ruin. Absolutely. I see we have developed a caste system. Meddling and exchange between these three classes, then, is the greatest harm that can happen to the city, and would rightly be called the worst thing someone could do to it. Exactly. And wouldn't you say that the worst thing that someone could do to his city is injustice? Of course. Then the exchange and meddling is injustice. Or, to put it the other way around, for the moneymaker, auxiliary, and guardian classes, each to do his own work in the city is the opposite. That is justice, isn't it? And makes the city just. I agree. Justice is that, and nothing else. Let's not take that as secure just yet. But if we find that the same form, when it comes to be in each individual person, is accepted as justice as well, we can assent to it. What else can we say? But if that isn't what we find, we must look for something else to be justice. For the moment, however, let's complete the present inquiry. We thought that if we try to observe justice in some other larger thing that possessed it, this would make it easier to observe in a single individual. We agreed that this larger thing is a city, and so we established the best city we could, knowing well that justice would be in one that was good. So let's apply what has come to light in the city to an individual, and if it is accepted there, all will be well. But if something is different is found in the individual, then we must go back and test that on the city. And if we do this and compare them side by side, we might well make justice light up as if we've been rubbing a fire stick together. And when it has come to light, we can get a secure grip on it for ourselves. You're following down the road we set, and we must do as you say. Well then, are things called by the same name, whether they are bigger or smaller than one another, like or unlike, with respect to that which the name applies? Alike. then a just man won't differ at all from a just city, in respect to the form of justice. Rather, he'll be just like the city. He will. But a city was thought to be just when each of the three national classes within it did its own work, and it was thought to be moderate, courageous, and wise because of certain other conditions and states of theirs. That's true. Then, if an individual has these three same parts in his soul, we will expect him to be correctly called by the same names as the city, if he has the same conditions in them. Necessarily so. Then once again we've come upon an easy question, namely, does the soul have these three parts in it or not? It doesn't look easy to me. Perhaps, Socrates, there's some truth in the old saying that everything fine is difficult. Apparently so. But you should know, Glaucon, that, in my opinion, we will never get a precise answer using our present methods of argument, although there is a longer and fuller road that does lead to such an answer. But perhaps we can get to an answer that's up to the standard of our previous statements and inquiries. Isn't that satisfactory? It would be enough for me at present. In that case, it will be fully enough for me too. Then don't worry, but go on with the inquiry. Well then, we are surely compelled to agree that each of us has within himself the same parts and characteristics as the city. Where else would they come from? It would be ridiculous for anyone to think that spiritedness doesn't come to be in cities, from such individuals as the Thracians, Scythians, and others who live to the north of us, who are held to possess spirit, and the same isn't true of the love of learning, which is mostly associated with our part of the world, or of the love of money, which one might say is conspicuously displayed by the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. It would. That's the way it is, anyway, and it isn't hard to understand. Certainly not. But this is hard. Do we do these things with the same part of ourselves, or do we do them with three different parts? Do we learn with one part, get angry with another, and with the same third part, desire the pleasures, food, drink, sex, and the others that are closely akin to them? Or, when we set out after something, do we act with the whole of our soul, in each case? That's what's hard to determine, in a way that's up to the standards of our arguments. I think so too. Well then, let's try to determine in that way whether these parts are the same or different. How? It is obvious that the same thing will not be willing to do or undergo opposites in the same part of itself, in relation to the same thing, at the same time. So, if we ever find this happening in the soul, we'll know that we aren't dealing with one thing, but many. Alright? Then consider what I'm about to say. Say on. Is it possible for the same thing to stand still and move at the same time, in the same part of itself? Not at all. Not at all. Let's make our agreement more precise, in order to avoid disputes later on. If someone said that a person who is standing still, but moving his hands and head, is moving and standing still at the same time, we wouldn't consider that. I think that he ought to put it like that. What he ought to say is that one part of the person is standing still and another part is moving. Isn't that so? It is. And if our interlocutor became even more amusing and was sophisticated enough to say that the whole spinning tops stand still and moves at the same time when the peg is fixed in the same place and they revolve, and that the same is true of anything else moving in a circular motion on the same spot, we wouldn't agree, because it isn't with respect to the same part of themselves that such things both stand still and move. We'd say that they have an axis and a circumference, and that with respect to the axis they stand still, since they don't wobble to either side, while with respect to the circumference they move in a circle. But if they do wobble to the left or right, front or back, while they are spinning, we'd say that they aren't standing still in any way. And we'd be right. No such statements will disturb us then. or make us believe that the same thing can be, do, or undergo opposites at the same time, and in the same respect, and in relation to the same thing. They won't make me believe it, at least. Nevertheless, in order to avoid going through all these objections, one by one, and taking a long time to prove them all untrue, let's hypothesize that this is correct and carry on. But we agree that if it should ever be shown to be incorrect, all the consequences we've drawn from it will also be lost. We should agree to that. Then wouldn't you consider all the following, whether they are doings or undergoings, as pairs of opposites, assent and dissent, wanting to have something and rejecting it, taking something and pushing it away? Yes, those are all opposites. Or what about these? Wouldn't you include thirst, hunger, the appetites as a whole, and wishing and willing, somewhere in the class we've mentioned? Wouldn't you say that the soul of someone who has an appetite for a thing wants what he has an appetite for, and takes to himself what it is his will to have, and that insofar as he wishes something to be given to him, his soul, since it desires this to come about, and nods assent to it, as if in answer to a question? I would. What about not willing, not wishing, and not having an appetite? Aren't these among the very opposites? Cases in which the soul pushes and drives things away? Of course. Then we won't say that there is a class of things called appetites, that the clearest examples are hunger and thirst. Sorry, I read that wrong. Then won't we say that there is a class of things called appetites, and that the clearest examples are hunger and thirst? We will. One of these is for food and the other is for drink. Yes. Now, insofar as it is thirst, it is an appetite in the soul for more than that for which we say it is an appetite. For example, is thirst for hot drink or cold, or much drink or little, or, in a word, for drink of a certain sort? Or isn't it rather that where heat is present as well as thirst, it causes the appetite to be for something cold as well, where cold for something hot, and where there is much thirst because of the presence of muchness, it will cause the desire to be for much, and where little for little. But thirst itself will never be for anything other than what it is in its nature to be, namely drink itself, and hunger for food. That's the way it is. Each appetite itself is only for its natural object, while the appetite for something of a certain sort depends on additions. Therefore, let no one catch us unprepared, or disturb us by claiming that no one has an appetite for drink, but rather good drink, nor food, but good food, on the grounds that everyone, after all, has appetites for good things, so that if thirst is an appetite, it will be an appetite for good drink, or whatever, and similarly with others. All the same, the person who says that has a point. But it seems to me that in the case of all things that are related to something, those that are of a particular sort are related to a particular sort of thing, while those that are merely themselves are related to a thing that is merely itself. I don't understand. Don't you understand that the greater is such as to be greater than something? Of course. Then the less. Yes. And the much greater than the much less. Isn't that so? Yes. And the once greater to the once less. And the going to be greater than the going to be less. Certainly. And isn't the same true of the more and the fewer? The double and the half, heavier and lighter, faster, slower, hot, cold, and all other such things? Of course. And what about the various kinds of knowledge? Doesn't the same apply? Knowledge itself is knowledge of what can be learned, or whatever it is that knowledge is of, while a particular sort of knowledge is of a particular sort of thing. For example, when knowledge of building houses came to be, didn't it differ from the other kinds of knowledge, and so was called knowledge of building? Of course. And wasn't that because it was a different sort of knowledge from all the others? Indeed. And wasn't it because of a particular sort of thing that it itself became a particular sort of knowledge? And isn't this true of all crafts and kinds of knowledge? It is. Well then, this is what I was trying to say. If you understand it now, when I said that of all things that are related to something, those that are merely themselves are related to things that are merely themselves, while those that are of a particular sort are related to things of a particular sort. However, I didn't mean that the sorts in question have to be the same for them both. For example, knowledge of health or disease isn't healthy or diseased, and knowledge of good or bad doesn't itself become good or bad. I mean that when knowledge became not knowledge of the thing, it's not knowledge of the thing itself that knowledge is, but of knowledge of something of a particular sort. The result was that it itself became a particular sort of knowledge, and this caused it to be no longer called knowledge without qualification, but with the addition of the relevant sort, medical or whatever. I understand. I think that's the way it is. Then, as for thirst, wouldn't you include it among things that are related to something? Surely thirst is related to... I know it's related to drink. Therefore, a particular sort of thirst is for a particular sort of drink. But thirst itself isn't for much or little, good or bad, or, in a word, for drink of a particular sort. Rather, thirst itself is in its nature only for drink itself. Absolutely. Hence, the soul of the thirsty person, insofar as he is thirsty, doesn't wish anything else but to drink, and it wants this and is impelled towards it. Clearly. Therefore, if something draws it back when it is thirsting, wouldn't that be something different in it from whatever thirsts and drives it like a beast to drink? It can't be, we say, that the same thing, with the same part of itself in relation to the same, at the same time, does opposite things. No, it can't. In the same way, I suppose, it's not well put to say of the archer that his hands at the same time push the bow away and draw it towards him. We ought to say that one hand pushes it away and the other draws it towards him. Absolutely. Now, would we assert that sometimes there are thirsty people who don't wish to drink? Certainly, it happens to many people. But what then should one say about them? Isn't it that there is something in their soul bidding them to drink, and something different forbidding them to do so, that overrules the thing that bids? I think so. Doesn't that which forbids in such cases come into play, if it comes into play at all, as a result of rational calculation, while what drives and drags them to drink is a result of feelings and diseases? Apparently. Doesn't that which forbids in such cases come into play, if it comes in... Sorry, I read the same line there, excuse me. As a result of feelings and diseases? Apparently. Hence, isn't it unreasonable for us to claim that they are two and different from one another? We'll call the part of the soul with which it calculates the rational part, we'll call the part of the soul which with it calculates the rational part, and the part with which it lusts, hungers, thirsts, and gets excited by other appetites, the irrational, appetitive part, companion of certain indulgences and pleasures. Yes, indeed. That's reasonable to think. Then, let these two parts be distinguished in the soul. Now, is the spirited part, by which we get angry, a third part, or is it the same nature as either of the two? Perhaps it's like the appetitive part. But I've heard something relevant to this, and I believe it. Leontius, the son of Aglion, was going up from the Piraeus along the outside of the north wall when he saw some corpses laying at the executioner's feet. He had an appetite to look at them, but at the same time he was disgusted and turned away. For a time he struggled with himself and covered his face, but finally, overpowered by the appetite, he pushed his eyes wide open and rushed towards the corpses, saying, "Look for yourselves, you evil wretches! Take your fill of the beautiful sight." I've heard that story myself. It certainly proves that anger sometimes makes war against the appetites, as one thing against another. Besides, we don't often notice in other cases that when appetite forces someone contrary to rational calculation, he reproaches himself and gets angry with that in him that's doing the forcing. So that of the two factions that are fighting a civil war, so to speak, spirit allies itself with reason. But I don't think you can say that you've ever seen spirit, either in yourself or anyone else, ally itself with an appetite to do what reason has decided must not be done. No, by God, I haven't. What happens when a person thinks he has done something unjust? Isn't it true that the nobler he is, the less he resents it if he suffers hunger, cold, or the like at the hands of someone whom he believes to be inflicting this on him, if he is being inflicted justly? And won't his spirit, as I say, refuse to be aroused? That's true. But what happens if, instead, he believes that someone has been unjust to him? Isn't the spirit within him boiling and angry, fighting for what he believes to be just? Won't it endure hunger, cold, and the like, and keep on till it is victorious, and not ceasing from noble actions until it either wins, dies, or calms down, cooled to a hill by the reason within him, like a dog by a shepherd? Spirit is certainly like that, and of course we made the auxiliaries in our city like dogs, to be obedient to the rulers, who are themselves like shepherds to our city. You well understand what I am trying to say, but also reflect on this further point. And what is that? The position of the spirited part seems to be the opposite of what we thought before. Then we... Was a fly moth in my room? Okay. Where was I? Then the position seems to be the opposite. The position of the spirited part seems to be the opposite of what we thought before. Then we thought of it as something appetitive. But now we say that it is far from being that, for in the civil war in the soul, it aligns itself far more with the rational part. Absolutely. Then is it also different from the rational part? Or is it some form of it, so that there are two parts in the soul, the rational and the appetitive, instead of three? Or rather, just as there were three classes in the city that held it together, the money-making, the auxiliary, and the deliberative, is the spirited part a third thing in the soul, that is by nature the helper of the rational part, provided that it hasn't been corrupted by bad upbringing? It must be a third. Yet, provided that we show it is different from the rational part, as we saw earlier, it was from the appetitive one. It isn't difficult to show that it is different. Even in small children, one can see that they are full of spirit right from birth, while as far as rational calculation is concerned, some never seem to get a share of it, while the majority do so quite late. That's really well put. And in animals too, one can see that what you say is true. Besides, our earlier quotation from Homer bears it out, where he says, "He struck his chest and spoke to his heart." For here, Homer clearly represents the part that has calculated about better and worse as different from the part that is angry without calculation. That's exactly right. Well then, we've now made our difficult way for a sea of arguments. We are pretty much agreed that the same number and the same kinds of classes as are in our city are also in the soul of each individual. That's true. Therefore, it necessarily follows that the individual is wise in the same way and in the same part of himself as the city. That's right. And isn't the individual courageous in the same way and in the same part of himself as the city? And isn't everything else that has to do with the virtue the same in both? Necessarily. Moreover, Glaucon, I suppose we'll say that a man is just in the same way as a city. That too is entirely necessary. And we surely haven't forgotten that the city was just because of each of the three classes in it. It was doing its own work. I don't think we could forget that. Then we must also remember that each one of us in whom each part is doing its own work will himself be just and do his own. Of course. Therefore, isn't it appropriate for the rational parts to rule, since it is really wise and exercises foresight on behalf of the whole soul, and for the spirited part to obey it and be its ally? It certainly is. And isn't it, as we were saying, a mixture of music and poetry on the one hand and physical training on the other, that makes the two parts harmonious, stretching and nurturing the rational parts with fine words and learning, relaxing the other part through soothing stories and making it gentle by means of harmony and rhythm? That's precisely it. And these two, having been nurtured in this way, and having truly learned their own roles, and been educated in them, will govern the appetitive part, which is the largest part in each person's soul, and is, by nature, the most insatiable for money. They'll watch over it, and see that it isn't filled with the so-called pleasures of the body, and that it doesn't become so big and strong that it no longer does its own work, but attempts to enslave and rule over the classes it isn't fitted to rule, thereby overturning everyone's whole life. That's right. Then wouldn't these two parts also do the finest job of guarding the whole soul and body against external enemies? Reason by planning, spirit by fighting, following its leader, and carrying out the leader's decision through its courage. Yes, that's true. And it is because of the spirited part, I suppose, that we call a single individual courageous, namely when it preserves, through pains and pleasures, the declarations of reason about what is to be feared and what isn't. That's right. And we'll call him wise because of that small part of himself that rules in him and makes those declarations, and has within it the knowledge of what is advantageous for each part and the whole soul, which is the community of all three parts. Absolutely. And isn't he moderate because of the friendly and harmonious relations between these same parts, namely, when the ruler and the ruled believe in common that the rational part should rule, and don't engage in civil war against it? Moderation is surely nothing other than that, both in the city and in the individual. And of course, a person will be just because of what we've so often mentioned, and in that way, necessarily. Well then, is the justice in us all indistinct? Does it seem to be something different from what we found in the city? It doesn't seem so to me. If there are still any doubts in our soul about this, we could dispel them altogether by appealing to ordinary cases. Which ones? For example, if we had to come to an agreement about whether someone similar in nature and training to our city had embezzled a deposit of gold or silver that he had accepted, who do you think would consider him to have done it, rather than someone who isn't like him? No one. And would he have anything to do with temple robberies, thefts, betrayals of friends in private life, or of cities in public life? No, nothing. And would he have anything to do with temple robberies, thefts, betrayals of friends in private life, or of cities in public life? No, nothing. And he'd be in no way untrustworthy in keeping an oath or other agreements. How could he? And adultery, disrespect for parents, and neglects of the gods would be more in keeping with every other kind of character than his. With every one. And isn't the cause of all of this that every part within him does its own work, whether it's ruling or being ruled? Yes, that and nothing else. Then, are you still looking for justice to be something other than this power, the one that produces men and cities of the sort we've described? No, I certainly am not. Then the dream we had has been completely fulfilled. Our suspicion that, with the help of some god, we had hit upon the origin and pattern of justice right at the beginning in founding our city. Absolutely. Indeed, Glaucon, the principle that is right for someone who is by nature a cobbler to practice cobblery and nothing else, for the carpenter to practice carpentry, and the same for the others, is a sort of image of justice. That is why it's beneficial. Apparently. And in truth, justice is, it seems, something of this sort. However, it isn't concerned with someone doing his own externally, but with what is inside him, with what is truly himself and his own. One who does not allow any part of himself to do the work of another, or allow the various classes within him to meddle with each other. He regulates well what is really his own and rules himself. He puts himself in order, is his own friend, and harmonizes with the free parts of himself, like free limiting notes on a musical scale, high, low, and middle. He binds together those parts and any others there may be in between, and from having been many things, he becomes entirely one, moderate and harmonious. Only then does he act, and when he does anything, whether acquiring wealth, taking care of his body, engaging in politics or in private contracts, in all of these he believes that the action is just and fine, that preserves this inner harmony and helps achieve it, and calls it so, and regards as wisdom the knowledge that oversees such actions. And he believes that the action that destroys this harmony is unjust, and calls it so, and regards the belief that oversees it as ignorance. That's absolutely true, Socrates. Well then, if we claim to have found the just man, the just city, and what the justice is in them, I don't suppose we'll seem to be telling a complete falsehood. No, we certainly won't. Shall we claim it then? We shall. So be it. I suppose we must now look for injustice. Clearly. Surely it must be a kind of evil. Well, he doesn't take a break here, does he? He's found his justice, immediately dives into the next topic. I guess that's Socrates for you. Surely it must be a kind of civil war between the three parts, a meddling and doing of another's work, a rebellion by some part against the whole, suited to be a slave, while the other part is not a slave at all, but belongs to the ruling class. We'll say something like that, I suppose, that the turmoil and straying of these parts of injustice, licentiousness, cowardice, ignorance, and in a word, the whole of vice, that's what they are. So, if justice and injustice are really clear to us, then acting justly and acting unjustly, and doing injustice are also clear. How so? Because just and unjust actions are no different from the soul than healthy and unhealthy things are for the body. In what way? Healthy things produce health, unhealthy ones disease. Yes. And don't just actions produce justice in the soul, and unjust ones injustice? Necessarily. To produce health is to establish the components of the body in a natural relation of control and being controlled, one by another, while another to produce disease is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled contrary to nature. That's right. Then isn't to produce justice to establish the parts of the soul in a natural relation of control, one by another, while to produce injustice is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled contrary to nature? Precisely. Virtue seems, then, to be a kind of health, fine condition, and well-being of the soul, while vice is a disease, shameful condition, and weakness. That's true. And don't fine ways of living lead one to the possession of vice, and shameful ones? And don't fine ways of living lead one to the possession of virtue, and shameful ones to vice? Necessarily. So it now remains, it seems, to inquire whether it is more profitable to act justly, live in a fine way, and be just, whether one is known to be or not, or to act unjustly and be unjusted, provided that one doesn't pay the penalty and become bitter as a result of the punishment. Whether it is better to act unjustly and be unjust, provided that one doesn't pay the penalty and become better as a result of punishment. But Socrates, this inquiry looks ridiculous to me now that justice and injustice have been shown to be as we have described. Even if one has every kind of food and drink, lots of money, and every sort of power to rule, life is thought not to be worth living when the body's nature is ruined. So even if someone can do whatever he wishes, except what will free him from vice and injustice, and will make him acquire justice and virtue, how can it be worth living when his soul, the very thing by which he lives, is ruined and in turmoil? Yes, it is ridiculous. Nevertheless, now that we've come far enough to be able to see most clearly that this is so, we mustn't give up. That's absolutely the last thing we must do. Then come here so that you can see how many forms of vice there are. Anyhow, that I consider worthy of examination. I'm following you, just tell me. Well, from the vantage points we've reached in our arguments, it seems to me that there is one form of virtue and an unlimited number of forms of vice, 4 of which are worth mentioning. How do you mean? It seems likely that there are as many types of soul as there are specific types of political constitution. How many is that? 5 forms of constitution and 5 of souls. What are they? One is the constitution we've been describing, and it has 2 names. If one outstanding man emerges amongst a ruler, it is called a kingship. If more than one, it is called an aristocracy. That's true. Therefore I say that this is one form of constitution. Whether one man emerges, or many, none of the significant laws of the city would be changed, if they followed the upbringing and education we described. Probably not. And that's where Book 4 ends. It ends rather abruptly in the middle of his describing of the various types of constitutions that countries take. He's going to start talking about democracies and tyrannies and oligarchies and all that sort of thing in the next book, I imagine. But that is where we got to. That was a very difficult one. And from little that I've heard of the Republic before having read this, I had heard that Book 4 is one of the major ones, and I can see why. That certainly got really quite heavy. And when I take my notes on that, it's probably going to take me a few hours to go through the book again and figure out what he's on about. It will be easier, though, since I've now read the book 4. It will be, and I see where he was going with the arguments. Reading back will be easier, and I'll be able to understand it. And we will come to an understanding. I am very glad that his conception of this city that he was making up was not literal. I'm very glad about that, because as it seems to be an actual city, it would be 1984. The worst city imaginable. They've got fort control, they're restricting people, there's no private property, they're living in barracks, they're not allowed any form of luxury. Madness. Madness. They're not even allowed to leave the city, punishment of death, and complete madness. But does it hold up as a metaphor for the soul, of the internal state of our being? Is it applicable, but not applicable to an external city? We'll have to consider that. We'll have to think about that, and see if that's what we agree to. But thank you for watching, and tune in next time for Book 5. We are, at this point,